murder of 78-year-old spinster Nancy Ems at her flat in Wandsworth on the 9th of April 1986 was a shocking and brutal one. Nancy was the first victim of a killer whose spree would eventually end with the deaths of 7 pensioners and 1 other victim emotionally scarred for life. This is the horrific case of Kenneth Erskine, the Stockwell Strangler. After the murder of Nancy Ems, the Stockwell Strangler claimed another 3 victims in the space of 9 weeks. The police now realized there was a serial killer on the loose and intensified efforts to find him. His death toll was now 4 and destined to rise. The only person to survive a vicious attack by the Stockwell Strangler was a gentleman called Frederick Prentice. Mr. Prentice was 73 and lived in an old people's home in South London. The Strangler attacked him while he lay in bed in the early hours of the 27th of June, 1986. After repeatedly throttling Mr. Prentice, the killer threw him to the floor and, presuming he'd killed him, fled the scene. Mr. Prentice was able to recall quite a few details about that night, but one thing in particular stuck in his mind. He said the Strangler had a terrible grin. "I shall always have his face in memory," he said later. "He ruined my life."
What becomes perfectly obvious from the description of the only witness who actually got away, a man called Prentice, was that he was grinning as he throttled him, and that he was obviously thoroughly enjoying this.
For his 5th murder, the Strangler travelled north of the Thames to Islington. Here he murdered 82-year-old William Carman in his bed on the 8th of July. After the murder of William Carman, the Strangler killed another 2 people in the space of a fortnight. Taken together, it was a horrifying catalogue of crime. Here was a serial killer, a man who, not content with a single murder, was searching for more victims to satisfy a bizarre craving, which had to be, partly at least, sexually motivated.
The characteristics of a sexual murderer are usually that they are the sadistic type, and that the ultimate thrill for them is to follow their torturing with actually killing their victim.
The reason that Kenneth Erskine targeted old people, I'm pretty sure, is because he had some kind of deep resentment and hatred concerning them. You see, what you have to take into account is that most of the victims were in fact old men, and what's more, most of them were sodomized. Now, you just would not expect a young man, and he was in his early 20s when these murders took place, to want to sodomize somebody who looks like the father from Steptoe and Son, and this, in point of fact, is what happened. So what's happening is, obviously, he hates these people. He feels that he hasn't been given a fair chance in life. He feels that, you know, being partly black, he's snubbed and generally badly treated. He prefers to live very rough, and although occasionally he has quite an amount of money, he had 2 bank accounts with a lot of money in them, he nevertheless preferred sleeping in Salvation Army hostels and that kind of thing. He feels himself completely on the outside of society in every possible way. He prefers living like that because he hates society, he hates these normal, respectable people. It must have given him tremendous pleasure that 2 of these old men, victims, one of them was a general in the army, or had been, and the other one had been a judge.
The Stockwell Strangler still had 1 more victim to claim before his reign of terror was over. The murder of 80-year-old Florence Tisdall was particularly shocking. Mrs. Tisdall was a frail widow, partially blind and defenseless. On the day she was killed, Mrs. Tisdall had enjoyed watching the royal wedding of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson on television. She'd even had her hair done, especially for the occasion. Mrs. Tisdall loved cats, and tragically it was this love of animals that may have indirectly led to her death. She liked to leave a window open in her flat at all times so her cats could come and go as they liked. Police concluded that it was through this window that the killer probably gained access to Mrs. Tisdall's home. At one stage, there were 150 officers working on the case of the Stockwell Strangler, collecting information and logging it on the Home Office computer, Holmes. But with all this technology at their disposal, it wasn't a computer that finally caught Erskine, but a manual search to match a palm print found at one of the crime scenes. Palm prints weren't stored on computer and so had to be matched manually, and it was this that led to the identification of Kenneth Erskine. Erskine was arrested outside a DHSS office in Southwark as he arrived to collect his weekly benefit check. Kenneth Erskine was a loner. Disowned by his family, he spent most of his life living on the streets, frequently stealing and getting caught. Before his arrest, he'd been in prison 4 times. His life was so empty of meaningful human contact that detectives were unable to trace a single possession of his or anyone who could say that they'd known him.
I would have said that he was quite definitely mentally subnormal in the sense that he had a number of hang-ups that were so bad that they could only be expressed through violence. I don't think he was mentally subnormal enough to be regarded as insane, but on the other hand, he went around with such a hatred of a particular kind of person, old people, because of some very bad experience which he'd obviously had. When Erskine was arrested, one of the problems was that they only had that one single clue, the palm print, and a jury might well find that, you know, that just was not enough. Later they did actually find a thumbprint that was also Erskine's, but at that early stage they had no real evidence except circumstantial evidence, and a palm print is not as good as a fingerprint for evidence in court. So what they wanted to do was to try and find out more about him. Nobody knew him. He had no friends. He seems to have drifted around all on his own, and so what they wanted to do was to try and find people who knew him and who could tell them stories about him, tell them who he was, why he did this. And so the solicitor, who said, well, there's already been so much about him, identifying him in the papers, that if any juror was going to be prejudiced, he'd be prejudiced by now, allowed the photograph to be published. And it had no effect whatsoever. They still found nothing whatsoever about him.
Kenneth Erskine was eventually charged with the murders of 7 pensioners. But is there any way to explain Erskine's urge to kill?
This case is an extreme example of the sadistic killer. Nearly all sadists stop short of inflicting permanent damage on their victims. But in this case, he really does seem to have gone to the extreme in both torturing and then killing his victims. It was almost certainly the case that he was a psychopath as well as being a sadist. So the two things coming together was a fatal combination.
Kenneth Erskine was found guilty on all counts on the 29th of January 1988. He was given 7 life sentences for the murders and an additional 12 years for the attempted murder of Fred Prentice. The judge presiding over the case recommended that Erskine serve a minimum of 40 years, but in 1997 the Home Secretary put Erskine's name on a list of convicted killers who will never be released.